beneath a dry lake bed north of Mexico City, in the ruins of houses that were rebuilt on the same foundations for nearly 300 years, a team of anthropologists knelt in the dirt and pulled 25 sets of human remains out of the ground. The bones came from ordinary homes, not palaces. The people buried in them were not emperors, not nobles, not anyone whose name survived in any Aztec codex or Spanish chronicle. And yet, when researchers ran their DNA, what they found quietly contradicted centuries of assumptions about how the Aztec Empire actually treated the people it conquered, and forced historians to reconsider a question that written records alone had never been able to answer. When an empire took over a city, did the same families really keep living there generation after generation, the way the official story always implied? Or did entire bloodlines simply vanish, replaced by someone else without anyone bothering to write that part down? This is the story of Xaltecan, a city-state that existed before the Aztecs, was swallowed by the Aztec Empire, and ultimately had its true history rewritten not by conquerors, not by colonial scribes, but by mitochondrial DNA extracted from its own dead centuries later. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who wants history reconstructed from hard physical evidence rather than the version conquerors wrote down about themselves, well, go ahead and like this video now. It genuinely helps put this kind of content in front of more people who care about getting it right. Let's set the stage properly, because to understand why this study matters, you need to understand what the Aztec Empire actually was. And it's not quite what most people picture. The word Aztec Empire tends to conjure a single unified civilization, but it was really a political alliance. In the year 1428, 3 city-states in the basin of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, formed what historians call the Triple Alliance. This alliance is what modern people generally mean when they say the Aztec Empire. Over the following decades, this alliance aggressively expanded outward, annexing dozens of smaller city-states and tribute-paying territories across central Mexico, sometimes through direct military conquest, sometimes through political pressure and forced tribute agreements. One of the places absorbed into this expanding system was Xaltecan, the capital of a smaller, older city-state that had existed on an island in a lake in the basin of Mexico long before the Aztecs rose to power. Xaltecan was the historical capital of the Otomi people, an ethnic and linguistic group distinct from the Nahuatl-speaking Aztecs themselves, with their own language, their own political structures, and their own centuries of independent history in the region before Aztec expansion ever reached them. According to surviving colonial-era documents, Xaltecan's population was first conquered not by the Aztecs directly, but by the Tepanec Empire, an earlier regional power, around the year 1395. Historical sources describing this period suggest that residents fled the city following this conquest. Later, once the Aztec Triple Alliance rose to dominance and absorbed the former Tepanec territories, documents indicate that the Aztec state deliberately sent new tax-paying settlers to resettle Xaltecan around 1435, roughly 40 years after the original population's displacement. If you take that written history completely at face value, the implication is fairly stark. The original Otomi inhabitants of Xaltecan were essentially wiped off the map, either driven out entirely or replaced by an imported population loyal to the new imperial order, all within about a single human generation. But archaeologists working the physical ruins of Xaltecan over the following decades found something that didn't sit comfortably with that narrative. Excavated houses in the city showed clear evidence of continuous rebuilding and reoccupation across the exact period when the population was supposedly replaced. Families appeared to be living, building, and rebuilding on the same house foundations across the transition from Tepanec to Aztec control, generation after generation, in a pattern that looked a lot more like continuity than replacement. This created a genuine, unresolved contradiction sitting right at the heart of Xaltecan's history. Written colonial-era sources described a population wiped away and resettled. The physical architecture on the ground suggested families staying put through the exact same upheaval. Historians had no reliable way to settle which version was closer to the truth, because both kinds of evidence, written records and building foundations, have serious limitations. Documents can reflect political propaganda, secondhand rumor, or administrative simplification. Rebuilt houses can just mean a location kept being useful, not that the same family kept living in it. This is exactly the kind of standoff that ancient DNA was built to break open. In research led by Jaime Matamigas, then an anthropology graduate student, in collaboration with researchers from the University of Texas at Austin, Wichita State University, and Washington State University, the team turned to something written records and building foundations could never provide on their own, a direct biological signature passed down through families themselves. They focused specifically on mitochondrial DNA, a distinct kind of genetic material that lives outside the cell nucleus and is passed down almost exclusively from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged except for slow trackable mutations. Unlike most of our DNA, which is a shuffled mix of both parents, mitochondrial DNA gives researchers something closer to a clean, unbroken maternal thread, letting them trace specific family lines directly back through time, almost like reading one continuous strand pulled out of a much larger tangled rope. The team extracted and analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 25 individuals recovered from patios outside 3 separate excavated houses in Zaltican, houses that had been continuously occupied and rebuilt between roughly 1240 and 1521. A span covering the pre-conquest Otomi period, the Tepanec conquest, and the subsequent Aztec imperial takeover. Crucially, the researchers were able to divide these 25 individuals into 2 clear temporal groups. Those who lived and died before the conquest period and those who lived and died afterward all recovered from the exact same physical households. If the architectural continuity theory was correct, if the same families really had simply kept living in these homes across the conquest, you would expect the maternal DNA lineages in the pre-conquest group to closely match the maternal DNA lineages in the post-conquest group. Same houses, same neighborhood, presumably the same families, passing the same maternal bloodlines forward through the exact same physical footprint of the city. That is not what the DNA showed. The pre-conquest maternal DNA and the post-conquest maternal DNA did not match. The haplotypes, the specific genetic maternal line signatures, were statistically distinct between the 2 time periods, different enough that researchers concluded the maternal lineages living in these households before the conquest were not the same lineages living in these households afterward. In plain terms, the women whose family lines were rooted in these specific homes before the Aztec era upheaval were, genetically speaking, gone by the time the next generation of residents moved through the same doorways. If you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating that a piece of bone can quietly overturn what buildings and documents both seem to suggest, this is exactly the moment that happens. So what actually took place at Zaltican? The genetic evidence doesn't hand us a single tidy answer, but it does let researchers build a far more specific theory than either the documents or the architecture could support alone. The most likely explanation researchers put forward is that the physical continuity of the houses and the biological continuity of the families living in them became 2 separate things during this period. The buildings stayed, the neighborhood stayed a functioning occupied part of the city, but the specific maternal lineages tied to the pre-conquest elite and general population of Zaltican appear to have been substantially displaced, possibly through the flight of at least some of the original ruling or elite families described in colonial sources, followed by a genuine influx of new residents under Aztec administration, who then intermarried with whatever original population remained. This lines up surprisingly well with the historical account of a deliberate resettlement effort around 1435, but it complicates it in an important way. It's not simply that Zaltican was emptied out and then refilled with an entirely new population, the way a purely document-based reading might suggest. It's that the human turnover was significant enough to genetically sever the maternal lines living in these specific households, while still leaving behind enough continuity and enough reuse of the exact same physical spaces to make the city look unbroken from the outside and in the archaeological record. Now, it's worth being precise about what this study can and cannot tell us, because this is exactly the kind of finding that's easy to oversimplify into a much bigger claim than the evidence actually supports. First, this research focused entirely on mitochondrial DNA, meaning it traces only the maternal line. It says nothing directly about paternal lineages, which in many historical societies, including likely Zaltican, could follow very different patterns of movement, marriage and residence than maternal lines. A community can show sharp maternal discontinuity while still maintaining more paternal continuity, or vice versa, depending on local marriage customs, such as whether men or women typically moved into a new household after marriage. Second, the sample size here is meaningful but modest. 25 individuals recovered from 3 houses in one part of one city, not a comprehensive survey of Zaltican's entire population across every neighborhood and social class. This tells us something real and statistically significant about these specific households, but it isn't a complete census of everyone who lived through this transition. Third, and this is important, mitochondrial DNA alone cannot definitively tell us why the maternal lineages changed. The data is consistent with several different real-world scenarios. The elite fleeing, as some documents suggest, a broader Aztec-directed resettlement effort bringing in new families, intermarriage patterns shifting after the conquest, or some layered combination of all 3 happening at once. Genetics can prove that the lineages changed. It cannot, by itself, tell us the full human story of exactly how or why that change happened, whether through violence, flight, policy, or simple demographic drift over a couple of generations. That part still depends on combining the genetic evidence with the documentary and archaeological record, not replacing one with the other. What makes this finding genuinely significant isn't that it delivers some clean, simple twist. It's that it reveals something both official, written history and physical archaeology, working alone, had each gotten only partly right. The documents captured something real, a genuine, significant population disruption tied to conquest and imperial resettlement policy. The architecture also captured something real, a genuine continuity in how the physical city itself kept functioning and being rebuilt. Neither source, by itself, could have told researchers that both things were true at once, that a place can look continuous on the surface while the actual bloodlines running through it are quietly, substantially rewritten underneath. There's a broader pattern worth sitting with here, one that extends well beyond this one lakeside city. For most of history, when an empire conquered a population, our only real record of what happened to the people living there came from the conquerors themselves, filtered through whatever version of events served their administrative or propaganda purposes, or from archaeological evidence that can describe buildings and objects far more easily than it can describe which specific families were living inside them. Xaltachán is a rare concrete case where scientists could directly test the biological reality of imperial expansion against both of those older kinds of evidence, and found that the true picture was more complicated and more disruptive to ordinary families than either source alone had suggested. It's also worth pointing out how differently this kind of finding lands compared to grander, more sweeping claims about entire empires or entire peoples. This wasn't a study claiming to rewrite the identity of the Aztec Empire as a whole, or to expose some singular, dramatic secret about a famous ruling dynasty. It was a careful, narrowly focused study about 25 specific people in 3 specific houses in one specific town, and what happened to their families across one specific conquest. That narrowness is exactly what makes it trustworthy. It doesn't overreach. It answers the question it was actually equipped to answer, and it leaves the rest honestly unresolved, which is precisely the kind of conclusion good science is supposed to produce, even when it's less dramatic than a headline might want it to be. And there's something quietly moving underneath all of this once you sit with it. The people whose bones were tested here were never named in any surviving chronicle. No Aztec tribute list preserved their identities. No Spanish colonial administrator wrote down their personal stories. For nearly 500 years, the only trace of what happened to them existed in the disputed gap between old documents and old foundations, an argument historians simply couldn't resolve. It took extracting genetic material directly from their own remains to finally let them, in a very real sense, testify to what actually happened to their families, long after every other kind of record had gone silent. If deep dives like this, where hard science quietly overturns what written history and physical ruins each seem to suggest on their own, are exactly the kind of content you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this kind of evidence-driven history still waiting to be uncovered. In the end, Xaltachán never stopped looking like the same city. The streets stayed in roughly the same place. The houses kept getting rebuilt on the same foundations, generation after generation, right through conquest and resettlement alike. But the people living inside those walls, the actual mothers and daughters whose bloodlines had rooted that city for centuries before the Aztec Triple Alliance ever rose to power, were largely gone by the time the dust settled. The buildings remembered the city. The DNA remembered who had actually been erased from it.